In our video, A Critique of Both Sidesism, we took aim at the idea that the liberal left and conservative right are equally bad across a variety of social and democratic metrics. They aren't. To give the game away, liberal leftists emerged as consistently better than conservative rightists on every factor evaluated. Today, we're going to turn away from social issues and towards economic ones. One might be tempted to think that even if the predominant left party in the US is better on social issues, then maybe people often vote for right wing candidates because they're better on the economy. Thus, American politics emerges as a balancing act between social priorities on the one hand and economic ones on the other. As we're going to show today, however, that simply isn't true. So let's jump right in. Today, we're going through the 2016 American Economic Review paper, Presidents and the U.S. Economy, an Econometric Exploration by Alan S. Blinder and Mark W. Watson. Well, the introductory section of the paper plainly lays out the argument. Quote, "The superiority of economic performance under Democrats rather than Republicans is nearly ubiquitous. It holds almost regardless of how you define success. By many measures, the performance gap is startlingly large, so large, in fact, that it strains credulity given how little influence over the economy most economists, or the Constitution for that matter, assign to the President of the United States." Close quote. To demonstrate this empirically, the paper tackles a series of topics, multiple economic indicators, whether Congress or some other factor is actually responsible for the economic success of Democrats, whether unrelated trends or inherited conditions explain this pattern, total factor productivity, wars, international economic events, fiscal policy, monetary policy, financial sector disruptions, and confidence, expectations, and uncertainty. This paper looks at presidents from Truman through Obama's first term. For Democrats, that's Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, Johnson, Carter, Clinton, first and second, and Obama. And for Republicans, that's Eisenhower, first and second, Nixon, Nixon and Ford, Reagan, first and second, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, first and second. During those 64 years, real GDP growth averaged 3.33% annually. However, that growth rate averaged 4.33% for Democrats and 2.54% for Republicans. That 1.79% difference is, to use Blinder's own words, quote, "astoundingly large relative to the sample mean." It implies that over a typical 4-year presidency, the U.S. economy grew by 18.5% when the president was a Democrat, but only by 10.6% when he was a Republican. And since the standard deviations of quarterly growth rates are roughly equal, 3.8% for Democrats, 3.9% for Republicans annualized, Democratic presidents have presided over growth that was faster, but not more volatile, close quote. In those 16 terms, there were 256 fiscal quarters. For reference, as implied by the word quarter, there are 4 in a year. Q1 is January, February, March, Q2 is April, May, June, Q3 is July, August, September, and Q4 is October, November, December. Because there is a lag between the inauguration of a president and their policies taking effect, the paper attributes the first quarter of each presidency to the previous president. For example, the recession quarter 2001-1 is charged to Bill Clinton, and 2009-1 is charged to George W. Bush. Quote, "Over the 256 quarters in these 16 terms, Republicans occupied the White House for 144 quarters, Democrats for 112. But of the 49 quarters classified by the National Bureau of Economic Research as in recession, only 8 came under Democrats versus 41 under Republicans. Thus, the U.S. economy was in recession for 1.1 quarters on average during Democratic terms, but for 4.6 quarters on average during Republican terms." Close quote. The paper experimented not just with extending the lag time to the first full year of a presidency, but also extending the lead time of a presidency into the previous presidency. Although these lags and leads made the partisan gap smaller, There was still a statistically significant gap. Intriguingly, though, the partisan gap has gotten smaller with time. The paper then turns to other economic indicators. GDP growth per capita, non farm business output, and industrial production are all statistically significantly higher under Democrats. The annual growth rate of payroll employment and the gap in employee hours in non farm businesses are statistically significantly higher under Democrats. The average unemployment rate is lower under Democrats, but not statistically significantly so. There is, however, a very large and statistically significant difference in the change in the unemployment rate, where the unemployment rate drops for Democrats and rises for Republicans. The growth rates of every major component of real GDP except exports and government non-defense purchases were higher under Democratic rather than Republican presidents, although the margins are small and statistically insignificant in a number of cases, with higher spending on consumer, durables, and private investment, especially non-residential fixed investment. Annualized stock market returns for firms in the S&P 500 are 5.65 percentage points higher when a Democrat occupies the White House than when a Republican does. The corporate profit share of gross domestic income was also higher under Democrats. Both real wages, compensation per hour in the non-farm business sector, and labor productivity increased slightly faster under Democrats than Republicans, although neither partisan gap is statistically significant. And growth in total factor productivity was much faster under Democrats. It is interesting then that businesses tend to vote for Republicans when they objectively fare better under Democrats. Further, federal budget deficits are on average smaller under Democrats, although this difference is not statistically significant, though it should be noted that the only time in recent political history when we had budget surpluses, with a program to pay down the national debt, was during the Clinton administration. The following Republican administrations ended that by lowering the top income tax rate, and the Obama administration was never able to persuade Congress to repeal the deficit-inducing tax rates. Perhaps most significantly and unsurprisingly, income inequality drops under Democrats, but rises to 1929 levels under Republicans. The only notable exception to the rule of Democrats outperforming Republicans economically comes from inflation, where the economy fares equally well under presidents of either party, though that warrants some historical context. In the 1970s, there was a mild inflation surge to 4%, and Richard Nixon decided to stop that by instituting wage and price controls, which ended up increasing inflation to 7%. Nixon's Watergate scandal resignation in 1974 left his successor, Gerald Ford, facing what came to be known as stagflation, which his Democrat successor, Jimmy Carter, was unable to quell either. By the time Reagan was elected in 1980, the persistent inflation was flirting with 15%, and his administration worked with Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker to bite the economic bullet and squeeze the inflation down to 2% by triggering a recession. That was a high cost, with 10% unemployment and 20% interest rates, and even when Reagan was reelected in 1984, inflation was still running around 7%, though dropping as the Fed policy was now to reach and sustain a 2% base rate, which is what occurred over the next 40 years. While the average inflation rate is slightly lower under Democrats, though also without statistical significance, there is a tendency for inflation to rise under Democrats and fall under Republicans. The reason for this doesn't really help the Republican economic cause because it involves weaker GDP growth and lower unemployment growth under them. Quote, with unemployment averaging 0.4 percentage points less under Democrats, traditional estimates of the Phillips curve suggest that the change in inflation should be roughly 0.1 percentage points more per quarter, or about 1.6 percentage points over a 4-year presidential term, which is close to what we find, close quote. Basically, the Phillips curve is the observation, though with lots of caveats, that there is an inverse relationship between money wage changes and unemployment. There has been a lot of debate over the usefulness of the Phillips curve. Some economists argue that it only describes inflation in the short run and that the curve has decreased with time. Even still, central banks continue to use the curve to predict inflation. What about if we go back further in time? Adding Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover notably increases the partisan gap with regard to real GDP growth. When the data gets pushed even further to 1875, in the middle of one of the major depressions occurring in the 19th century, the next one of the 1890s, also triggered by Republican policies during the Harrison administration, Democrats still retain a lead on real GDP growth, but it becomes smaller, losing its statistically significant advantage. That gap is maintained entirely by the FDR administration, thus, it would be more accurate to say real GDP growth was higher from Ulysses Grant through Calvin Coolidge, with Democrats attaining economic superiority from Hoover onwards or 1929 to today. And keeping with the earlier conclusion, recession quarters occurred more under those earlier Republicans than Democrats, though the 19th century trend is skewed because most of the presidents in that period were Republicans, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson being the only two exceptions. Given all of these conclusions, we now have to ask, is there something other than the presidency that is actually responsible for the economic superiority of Democrats? Could it be, for example, that Congress is a better indicator of economic growth? After all, despite what Donald Trump seems to think, the power of the purse rests with Congress, not the president. Shocking as it may sound, the answer is no. It's true that average GDP growth is trivially higher when there is a Democrat Congress under a Democrat president, but average GDP growth is still statistically significantly higher with a Republican Congress under a Democrat president than with either Congress under a Republican president. Okay, then let's turn elsewhere. Maybe the partisan gap could stem from different trend growth rates under Democratic and Republican administrations, or whether Democrats were more likely than Republicans to be elected when the economy was poised for a period of rapid growth, so that causality runs from growth to party rather than from party to growth. Regarding the former, quote, since trend increases in the labor force and productivity were higher in the early post-World War II years than they have been since, say, 2000, part of the difference in the average growth rates under Democrats and Republicans might be explained by the timing of these low-frequency movements. This possibility is investigated in online Appendix B, where we compute average growth rate differences after detrending the quarterly GDP growth rates using a variety of long, two-sided weighted moving averages. The analysis there shows that low-frequency factors explain little, if any, of the Democrat-Republican gap. Close quote. For the latter, maybe the partisan gap is explained by a Democrat taking office right after a Republican puts in a bunch of policies stimulating economic development. In that case, the causality is backwards. The policies undergirding economic performance precede the political party under which most of the performance occurs. But, as Figure 2 shows, this simply isn't true. Democrats inherit an, on average, statistically significantly worse economy from Republicans than Republicans inherit from Democrats. Rather glaringly, in the case of 1893, when Benjamin Harrison's high tariffs and inflationary silver policies handed Grover Cleveland's second term an economy poised to collapse into the worst depression of the 19th century. In the 20th century, the highest GDP growth occurs during the first 2 years of a Democrat presidency, slowly decreasing afterwards, whereas GDP growth for Republicans only outpaces that of Democrats during the Republicans' third year in office. Quote, thus, growth slows sharply and quickly when a Republican is elected, but accelerates on a dime following the election of a Democrat, close quote. The case of Obama would be a spectacular example of that, as the economy began an immediate and sustained rebound on his watch, clawing back the losses from the Bush 2008 meltdown, and where the Dow Jones stock market index showed a growth rate under Obama identical to the great bull market of the Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton years, ultimately rising far higher than the pre-recession level under George W. Bush. One variable the paper explores to explain the partisan gap is oil shocks, which does indeed contribute to the difference. The largest negative effects came under George W. Bush, with oil prices increasing threefold during his second term. Regarding total factor productivity, which is the ratio of aggregate output such as GDP to aggregate input, the paper points out that this measurement has to be cyclically adjusted, and even so, it's higher under Democrats. What about wars? Quote, sharp increases in military spending tend to cause growth spurts, and sharp cutbacks in military spending can cause recessions, close quote. Concerning this, quote, Truman presided over the Korean War boom and Eisenhower ended it. Johnson presided over the Vietnam buildup, while Nixon, after a long delay, ended it. But on the other hand, Reagan initiated a huge military buildup in peacetime, and both Bushes were wartime presidents, close quote. While it is true that real military spending dramatically increased under Democrats compared to Republicans, federal defense spending accounts for just 8% of GDP over the post-war period. In other words, this is far too small of a factor to account for the significant difference between the parties. Interestingly, nearly all of the partisan gap for defense spending comes from just the Korean War. Excluding the Truman administration, spending becomes nearly the same across parties. Otherwise, shocks to defense spending do little to explain the partisan gap. What about international economic events? The paper succinctly explains, quote, none of this is to deny that there are foreign influences on US GDP growth. It's just that they don't appear to play any role in the Democrat-Republican gap, close quote. What about fiscal policy? Fiscal policy appears to be more stabilizing for the economy under Republicans, and as we saw, the deficit is on average larger under Republicans. Thus, fiscal policy cannot explain the partisan gap. What about monetary policy? Quote, the U.S. economy did grow faster under Democratic Fed chairmen than under Republican chairs, close quote. Furthermore, quote, the average levels of both nominal and real interest rates were lower under Democratic presidents, but these differences do not come close to statistical significance. There is, however, a notable tendency for both the nominal and real federal funds rate to rise during Democratic presidencies and fall during Republican presidencies, suggesting that the Fed normally tightens under Democrats and eases under Republicans. Of course, such an empirical finding does not imply that the Fed was playing politics to favor Republicans. Rather, it is just what you would expect if the economy grew faster with rising inflation under Democrats and slower with falling inflation under Republicans, as it did, close quote. What about financial sector disruptions? The paper uses a couple different methods to try to measure these disruptions. There was significant financial turbulence under George W. Bush's second term during the 2007 recession, but there was a larger negative effect on growth under Carter, presumably due to the credit controls of 1980. Again, this doesn't explain the gap. And finally, what about confidence, expectations, and uncertainty? Consumer confidence is hard to measure, but polls seem to indicate a negligible difference between the parties. As for business confidence, surprisingly, the Small Business Optimism Index shows a slight but statistically insignificantly higher degree of confidence in small businesses under Democrats compared to Republicans. One has to wonder then where the narrative of small businesses love Republicans comes from. The performance of the stock market between Election Day and Inauguration Day gives a slight edge to Republicans, even though, as seen earlier, the stock market does better overall under Democrats. Consumer expectations differ little between the parties, and apparently, consumers express less uncertainty towards Republicans. Another factor should not be overlooked. It is likely no coincidence that Hispanic migrants were expelled during the Hoover Depression years, an era which had already drastically cut immigration sources for the labor force, and again under Eisenhower, who got a serious recession late in his second term. Today's xenophobic persecution of undocumented workers is unlikely to help the economy any more than those previous efforts did. Given all of this data, what conclusions can we draw? For starters, the large and systematic gap between the parties' performances appears to relate to the presidency regardless of Congress. Quote, specifically, Democratic presidents have experienced, on average, better oil shocks than Republicans, some of which may have been induced by foreign policy, faster growth of defense spending, if the Korean War is included, and a better record of productivity shocks, which may relate to many different policies. More tenuously, both in terms of sample size and statistical significance, Democratic presidents may have also benefited from stronger growth abroad, close quote. Thus, we can see that Republicans are not, and have not been, the party of fiscal responsibility for almost a century. In closing, I want to say that I am genuinely disappointed by the facts presented here. I would much rather believe that politics is a tug of war between social issues and the economy, but that just isn't true. Democrats do better on both, so that suggests a much deeper, fundamental problem with the way Americans process information. Why is there such a perception of the GOP as the pro-business, fiscally responsible ones? Well, as we saw in the war on science and asymmetric propaganda, the answer is industrial-scale misinformation. Sorry to end on such a dour note. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.